So, welcome to the very first episode of Concerning Primus, where we'll be discussing the lore of Primus, the world I've constructed both for the campaign and, of course, for the overall Imperium storyline as a whole, since Primus is actually rather relevant to the Imperial storyline. Now, before I begin, I'd just like to say if anybody has any requests for anybody who's actually interested in the Primus storyline or the world thereof, this goes to my players as well, since several of my players are some of the people who requested this become a feature. Go ahead and put it in the comments. If there's something you want me to talk about or expound upon next, I'm listening and I'm totally open to suggestions or options. The first 3 episodes are already set in stone. I already know the first 3 things I'm going to talk about. But after that, of course, it's just whatever, because there's so many things to discuss, right? With that all being out of the way, I figured it would be the best place to start would be where the story and the campaign began, Visayan Lacell. Now, brief aside, we're going to be discussing things with what I call a spoilery perspective. In other words, this is all the information that the players and viewers would have available to them at this point in time because of the fact that the campaign has been running for a couple of years now, and so some of the secrets and some of the hidden things have been unveiled. So that's how I'm going to be discussing the lore as of for everything that's known to the audience as of the moment I'm discussing it. Make sense? So, Visayan Lacell was an artificial island created out of the Earth elemental ley line by the Lady Airfall, who was one of the emperors, so-called, of the ancient Scions. Now, to discuss in brief, the ancient Scions were... Originally there was 4 of them, and the 4 of them, through things that nobody's really 100% sure what happened now, basically birthed an entire race who was incapable of having children. So the population was unmoving unless they died, in which case the population was shrinking. You understand the problem. Now, amongst them, there was 4 individuals called the 4 Kings, who were skilled, powerful individuals with political and backing and general acumen with regards to tactics, science, etc. These 4 kings were wanting to rebel against the 4 emperors, which doesn't really work when you're a species where every thought is shared instantaneously and without issue, Everything you've ever thought is shared. What ended up happening instead was 2 of the emperors decided to back the plans of the 4 emperors, of the 4 kings, in order to create basically a pocket kingdom. 4 islands built out of 4 of the elemental ley lines, 1 for each king, and each one having a particular job in order to help support the others. In this way, they ensured that no particular king would grow dominant over the others, and of course, they would all remain segregate from everything else, because the only way in or out would be, well, let's just say it's very difficult to do, because they were going to enact a trick, something that was crafted by one of the kings, a gentleman named Mandukir, who came up with the idea to hide the islands in such a way so that if you're looking right at the island, you don't see it. It doesn't process in your brain. And if you try to head towards it, you'll find yourself steering around it or trying to avoid it for whatever reason. You'll come up with a reason, in other words, right? So they would be completely hidden from external stimuli. 4 completely isolated kingdoms. The funny thing was, the 4 kings wanted their own kingdoms. One of the emperors, a woman named Airfall, the one who studied and designed these islands, wanted something else. It hasn't been revealed what yet. And another of the emperors, a gentleman named Rytherin, also wanted something else, also not revealed yet. Regardless, this brings us to Visayan Lacell. Now, when this was happening, this is slightly relevant because this was happening right about the time a threat known as the Shadow started rising in the Scion Empire in Oburian to the east. No one's still really sure what or how the Shadow is, but they know that it kind of crushed the entire Psionic Empire in a matter of about a year. So that's significant. But these 4 kingdoms were quickly being perceived to be the only way to hide from the Shadow threat, and therefore being the last vestiges of psionic society. And in fact, that probably would have been true if not for the fact that every psion in the planet, with a very small number of exceptions, was wiped out one day through mysterious means, and no one's actually discovered why that is yet. But this brings us to Visayan Lacell itself, made out of the Earth ley line specifically. Now, let's discuss in brief what it means to be an island that's so artificially constructed. First of all, the island itself constantly regenerates itself in a way that is conductive towards its element. So this place has literally infinite resources when it comes to certain things, such as fresh water, which is untainted by salt or anything like that, and certain mineral resources that are available on the island, most notably copper and bronze, which are in huge supply. There's also actually gold, silver, iron, and pyrrole on the island. Although, for reasons that'll become obvious in a minute, the denizens of Visayan Lacell never really dug in that far. And the terrain is incredibly arable. You don't have to do crop rotations or anything like that because the terrain will just naturally replenish itself. So you can just keep growing carrots or having a particular area be trowed by the same cows forever. And it doesn't change anything because it'll constantly be replenishing itself. Partially, now Visayan Lacell is different from the other 4 islands in one key distinction. Mandakir himself came up with another device that kind of twisted Visayan Lacell so that it was removed from reality, kind of. The visual representation I always gave was that the island is here, big island, huge island, about the size of New Guinea, give or take. And as you look out, you would see these waterfalls. Huge, ridiculously tall waterfalls in a complete circle around the island, surrounding it. So the island and the surrounding area is basically sunk into the ocean perfectly, right? Well, that's not actually physically what happens because, well, number one, that's not physically possible and would also cause a lot of issues with regards to lighting and weather and whatnot. But more importantly, because what actually was happening, and I like to describe this in this way, the Visayan Lacell was twisted. So it was closer to the elemental plane of Earth, if such a thing existed, than it was the physical plane of the continent, or excuse me, the planet. So it was kind of twisted inwards, which gave it a second layer of protection, in addition to the you don't see it there, you don't want to go there kind of a thing. That has some consequences we'll get to in a few minutes here. So when so the island constantly replenishes itself. This leads itself to a couple other oddities. There's constant elemental energy just flowing through the area. It's so overwhelming and it's so enriching. To give you a direct example, this is my favorite personal example of how the island is. People there don't have bad eyesight. They all have perfect eyesight. When that energy is removed later on, suddenly people who would be, nearsighted or farsighted like I am, couldn't see all of a sudden, had no idea how to function it. It also completely changed the way that their science, their culture, their economics, everything about them advanced as a society because they were all dependent on a status that didn't exist anywhere else. I almost feel sad because all of this story and culture I'm about to share with you is basically gone and only serves as a backstory now to explain why the humans are screwed in the modern era, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But for example, buildings. Buildings could be constructed without much or significant knowledge of engineering or architecture or physics because they didn't need to be. They could be maintained, at least within some effort had to be taken. But I mean, we're talking massive towers could be made without any concept of support struts or proper balancing beams or anything like that. Now, when that energy was removed, those towers, because physics took over again, right? This also affected a lot of other things, but I don't want to go over the entire list. You get the general idea. No deaths from childbirth, for example. No major diseases or illnesses or viruses. Nobody with blood conditions. Nobody who has kidney stones, commonplace stuff like that. Nobody with back pain, right? Very, very idyllic thing. And in many ways, it could be called a paradise. About 347 years ago, give or take, all the Scions wiped out, just like that. This is the event known as Year Zero, by the way, as I'll refer to it in the future. Although most people in character are not aware of the connection between the Scions being wiped out and that being the beginning of the new calendar. The two events don't coincide perfectly for reasons I'll discuss in the next video. So, pardon me. When all the Scions were wiped out from the island, because there were Scions living here, of course. Okay, let me rewind a bit. Each of the 4 islands had a purpose, like I said, to balance everything out. Mary Lacell produced all the food. Aphis Lacell produced, equipment, material, industry, that kind of a thing. Erlinth Lacell was exploration and knowledge and science and that kind of thing. And of course, Visayan Lacell was where the slaves were, basically, where the people were. A huge population, far bigger than the others. Almost entirely humans, all of whom were in a constant state of what's referred to as mind slave. In other words, they literally are not cognizant. The best way I can describe it is they're effectively asleep. And they're still fully functional. They still have the ability to think and reason and talk and everything, but they're completely and utterly controlled by their psionic masters. And this is just the way things are with the Scions, as I'll talk about when we talk about the Scions in more depth. But when that control is removed, the person basically wakes up and has no memory of anything that's ever happened. So for an entire society where entire generations, plural, have been born in a state of mind slave, you can imagine what happened when people just woke up one day and knew nothing. Like, you could literally imagine a wife and a husband waking up and having no idea who each other is, or a daughter and a father, and all sorts of relationships like that. No concept whatsoever for anything. First few months there were pretty chaotic. But within a fairly short period of time, it kind of settled, and they had a pretty violent interaction with each other. It led to the closest thing to war the Visayan Lacell has ever had, until finally people, leaders arose basically in the mess and said, okay, look, let's look at the situation. Because Visayan Lacell was in a unique situation. As long as they continued to be careful about things, they wouldn't suffer from some of the problems from being an isolated society. The land continuously replenished most of the resources, so as long as we don't destroy the land or overly, overpopulate it or overharvest it, we're fine. And as long as we don't kill off too many of our own people, we're going to continue having a viable population for the future, because the birth rate and death rate was actually pretty stable amongst humans. By the way, humans are not the only race on Visayan Lacell. There is an extremely small pocket of elves and dwarves as well. Just pointing that out because it isn't really relevant, but it is something that is true. Predominantly, we're talking like 95% of the population of these several dozen million people were all humans. Okay. This is also the greater bulk of the human race in the entire planet. I don't feel like spoiling, because as has been discovered, the only other place that has humans is Apis Lacell, and we'll talk about that later. So they got together and they just started to ratify what became sort of a code of law for Visayan Lacell, laying down how their society would basically be structured. It's like this. There are protected resources, and everything else can be whatever. Now, a protected resource is something that, by law, cannot be destroyed or influenced or taken or hurt or wounded. The idea is not to take it away from the environment, because they might not be able to replenish it, right? This includes people. Yes, you heard me right. An entire generation, actually 300 years of humans, lived in a society where killing another person was considered unconscionable and incredibly illegal. It still happened, because that's how life is. But we're talking the rare exceptions. We're talking the occasional, sociopath or someone who is actually psychotic, chemically, medically psychotic, and that's where killing happened. And for the most part, all other deaths were natural, or a result of attacks from some of the monsters on the island. Indeed, harpies are actually one of the major threats they had to deal with, and another reason why they wanted to unite under these circumstances. So, human lives, and of course, elf and dwarf lives, but sapient life was considered a protected resource. So was the ocean. You couldn't claim the ocean. There was a great bounty of fish and sea and other resources you could pull from that to help keep people fed. The land itself was considered a protected resource and had to be very carefully part and parceled out so that people had enough room to live, but there was also enough farmland and, of course, graze land for the animals, that kind of a thing. And finally, the last thing that was considered a protected resource, it's harder to describe. So let's get into the politics of how things happened. Over time, three groups they discovered bits and pieces of whomever had been here before everyone just woke up. Again, I can spoil a few things for you because these have already been spoiled in campaign. The Scions, when they went away, they didn't leave bodies behind. So, for example, if I'm walking around and I'm carrying my phone here, and I'm like, phone drops, right? Falls on the ground. So they found a few bits and pieces of the psionic people, but most psionic technology and magic technology requires psionic mind speak to access. So nobody could do anything with it. It would literally be like trying to, control a computer with no keyboard, right? So they could find a computer and they're like, well, okay. And so they didn't really advance much. They had extremely basic technology, extremely basic magic, but the reason I bring this up is they did find a few things that were written in languages they could actually understand, and they found out that there had been 3 great houses which had been predominant on the island. All 3 of these are actually psionic houses, and again, I don't feel like this is a spoiler, technically, but it's something that's been revealed at this point in time. These are also houses amongst the Derikost, the House of Telvanni, the House of Redoran, and the House of Hlelu. Each of these 3 houses, there, people started saying, okay, well, let's divvy up. So we'll be Hlelu, we'll be Redoran, we'll be Telvanni. And the Telvanni basically decided to, each group basically started over generations, over decades, started kind of falling into their own little niche of government. House Lelu became all about wealth and the distribution of wealth. House Redoran became all about discipline and order and a more militaristic vibe. And of course, House Telvanni became a bureaucracy of doom, but we'll get into that later. Or maybe we won't, I guess, because it's not that relevant. Now, the way the politics worked is unique. First of all, let's actually talk about the economy really quick. They had currency, but they almost never used it. They didn't actually really use coins, per se, because, wasting copper and silver and gold and iron on coinage just seemed unnecessary, given how difficult it was for these people to work any of these metals. By the way, iron, incredibly rare on the island. Most people are walking around in copper weapons and armor, or basic leather armor, that kind of a thing. Absolutely, completely, baseline stuff, right? Fun fact, I had a few players complain about that fact when I unveiled it, but moving along. So yeah, the economy, the way it primarily worked is you would get a slip of paper, little thing like this, and this slip of paper would be like, hey, here is a writ that says I own this house. It's literally the deed to a house, or the deed to a farm, or the deed to a cart, whatever. Usually some kind of real estate, but some kind of property, right? And anytime any new property was made or designed, and I'm talking like large-scale property, if you make a book, you don't have to make a piece of paper for that book, but anything large-scale had a deed attached to it, and those were actually used as currency, literally a kind of in-between of literally using coin-based currency and a barter-based economic system. Now, of course, this is at the higher levels of the governments and how the economy functioned, because at the lower levels, it's basically a pure barter system. I make pies with the stuff in my orchard, and I trade those pies for meat and clothing and all that fun stuff from the people who do those things, right? Because it was such a relatively small community of, again, only a few dozen million people across a relatively small island, this was feasible, this was functional, this could be done. I suppose I should pause one moment to explain something about the geography of the island, because I just realized I haven't. It's actually extremely simple, geographically speaking. It's like this. There's one massive mountain chain in the middle, and then it smooths out like this. I picture it. In fact, there is a map of Visayan Lacell and all of the islands and continent of Dareth as well, that I spent absolutely forever working on. But regardless, big old island, right? And that mountain is basically unsettled. People go in there for logging and the like in order to procure wood and certain bounties of the forest. But for the most part, people avoid the mountain for two reasons. One, that's where the harpies and the other somewhat more obstinate monsters tend to hang out. And two, it's really hard to actually settle in that area. Oh, and I suppose three, it's something of a holy site. You see, there are lots of psionic buildings and structures that are still there that, well, are basically locked, and so nobody can get into them or indeed do anything with them unless they are a scion. I mentioned this problem earlier. So they're just these massive buildings of architectural wonder that they can't do anything with. So they just look at them and they go, ah. So, it's a common place to go if you want to reflect on yourself, or if you want to have a quiet moment with someone, or if you want to, take a vacation, that kind of a thing. Of course, that's also very dangerous because, as I just mentioned, harpies and whatnot are a problem there, but moving along. So, with these writs of trade, House Lelu really started working on building what is effectively a mercantile empire, one entirely dominated around trade. They postulated that as long as those things kept moving, it would be better for everyone. Like a fluid economy is what they wanted to have. So they kept doing this, and they made a system where they had a series of counselors who ran the entire house. And these counselors, there was a unique method for becoming a counselor after the first few were elected, and that method was you have to buy your way in. You have to literally buy your way in, bribe your way in, pay your dues in order to purchase a seat on the counselorship. And if you have the funding and the economic backing to do that, then congratulations, you are a new counselor of Lelu. Over time, the number of counselors over the 350 plus years, the number of counselors kind of goes like this, because sometimes there's whole periods where people can't buy their way in. But sometimes there's ones where tons of people can, so there's just a bit of a glut. And it kind of follows the economic flow, as you might imagine. House Redoran did things on a bit of a meritocracy situation. You proved your worth. House Redoran believed strongly in trying to demonstrate through actions that they could accomplish things. So, for example, well, banditry was a problem on Visayan Lacell. Of course it was. But it was, of course, much, I guess, more gentrified is the word I want to use here than it would be elsewhere, especially on Dareth, or worse than Dareth, because, humans are a protected resource. You don't want to be the bandit that ends up killing someone. That's not going to go well for you. So instead, bandits would be like, quick, steal, run. So House Redoran was dedicated towards taking out bandits, taking out harpies, taking out beasts, taming areas where monsters or beasts had gone wild, that kind of a thing. The closest, I say this because it's the closest thing to a military the entire island really had, and it's functionally a low-level militia using incredibly basic strategies and equipment, because again, they don't have to try that hard. There's more to this, which I'll get to in a second, because there is warfare on Visayan Lacell, but I got to build up the houses first. And so in that system, the better you do, the higher up you get pushed until you end up being one of the upper echelons of the people who run the entire house, most of whom have been decorated in service for years and years, right? In House Tilvani, they have a system where basically it's sort of a absolute democracy, but it's not absolute, because it's more like, let me put it this way. Let's say there's a town, and I go to this town, and I want to convince everyone in this town to say I'm the head of this town, I'm the mayor of this town, whatever title you want to use. So I go to this guy and I talk to him, and I go to this guy and I talk to him, and I just go through this town of however many hundred people. And after talking to them all, like convincing them all, it's like, okay, yes, you have swayed us. They all then say, I'm the new mayor. Whether there was a previous mayor or not, I am now the new mayor. The thing is, once I am the mayor, now I no longer have to care about them. I only have to care about the other people who are at my status. See, that's the weird thing about Tilvani politics. In order to move up, you have to get the agreement of everyone at your level. But once you move up, you no longer care about the people below your level. So it created a system where there were entire people on the upper echelons who were playing, I hate using this phrase, but it's accurate, a Game of Thrones without actually doing much of anything. And this is why I call themselves the bureaucracy house, because really all they were doing was constantly playing their little trying to convince other people, wheeling and dealing games with each other. And I do say games because it was all effectively just words, meaningless, no real power, as I like to say, all politics. It still works, though, because basically it's kind of a similarity to, I can't remember the name of the term. There was a term in 90s corporate America where you would get promoted past the level of your competence. It's kind of like that, except in reverse. It's more like you get promoted past the point where you can do anything. So anybody who was dedicated enough to becoming that powerful would effectively be removed from actually doing anything, and therefore making anything worse. So at the lower levels, the people who were interested in just running their town or running their shop or whatever, they were fine, because that was the extent of their ambition and they didn't want to go any higher. Make sense? Now, I mentioned warfare. The three houses were in a de facto state of hostility basically all the time. Now, the way this worked is funny, because let's say, for example, there's some Tilvani troops, and they march on a Redoran territory. They march on a town in Redoran, and they'll just stand there and wait until, carrier words or pigeons or whatever, carry to Redoran command that they are being challenged. So then Redoran troops will come up, and they'll do a fight, and the goal is... This is going to sound funny. It's like LARPing, almost, because the goal is to wound someone or knock them out, or basically convince them to stop fighting, but without killing them. Because that's really important, right? Protected resource. So and it's all very professional. It's all very courteous. Most of the time, the troops on both sides would actually be friends with each other or know each other from previous engagements. Hey, Bill, what's up? All right, let's do this. Wow, it was practically sport. In fact, I would actually go so far as to say that's a better example of what this is. This was sports, not actual warfare. Now, the way this works is by the codified laws that I mentioned earlier, the ones established 340 years ago. What determined the boundaries of the three houses was if you could prove that you could maintain and defend that territory, it was yours. So that's how that challenging thing happens. If House Lelu decides to move over here, you have to then contest that. And if you don't, then House Lelu formally claims it, and this is now Lelu territories. The funny thing is there's not a huge benefit to having more territory for a given house. It's mostly a prestige thing, and again, kind of as like a sport. But it's something that kept the political balance and the more aggressive nature of the humans in check for 3.5 centuries, so it apparently worked. I think that's all the background info. Now let's talk a little bit what happened after the fact, because this is kind of relevant as well. When Firnacil and Flux went into the psionic facility, they found Mandicure's, overriding instructions and device about, separating the island, and there was a command in there that could it was an emergency command, only to be used in emergencies, to raise the island, which would reconnect it with the outside world. So they did that. Here's the problem. I want you to picture like this is the elemental ley line, and here was the island. And when the island is actually constructed out of the ley line, so it's just kind of drawing off of it like this, right? But then Mandicure did his thing, which twisted it, and that kind of pulled the ley line down here, right? Well, when it was untwisted, the island was up here and no longer actually connected to the ley line. That's not the best visual representation I could give, but I think you get the idea. Without that constant connection and energy flow maintaining the island, it started to disintegrate. Literally disintegrate. Now, fortunately, that's a colossal amount of mass, so it would, they had a couple of weeks before the entire island just sank into muck into the sea. But yeah, so, and that caused a lot of problems. For example, I mentioned earlier, people suddenly just couldn't see properly because they had eyesight problems. Buildings, like those towers I mentioned, collapsed. There was a lot of mudslides because the terrain literally couldn't withstand. Oh, speaking of which, there was also rain for the first time in the history of the island. Because they'd been so separate, they didn't have weather in the strictest sense of the word. They had sunlight, and that's it. They didn't have clouds. They didn't have cold days or hot days, because again, they were separate from the basic physical reality. So now that they were here, they came out in about January, so it was cold and it was wet, and there was a storm that happened to be forming over the area when the island was returned to the physical plane. So yeah, there was this massive storm that was just, and nobody had any idea what to do about it. I mean, rain, water's coming from the sky, oh my god. You can imagine the state of panic this caused. The funny thing is, I mentioned earlier the structural problems. That wasn't just for flavor. These people have navies, relatively large navies, actually. A lot of what they do is on the sea, and these people have tried to scale the walls of the waterfall in the past. Of course, that doesn't work because there's no physical wall there, so the ships would go out there and basically be eaten by the ley line, and all those people would die. But these ships were constructed with the understanding of physics and the understanding of technology that I had mentioned before, the very truncated version that was adapting to the constant Earth ley line, etc. So a lot of these ships were very unsound, is what I'm trying to say. So several of these ships tried to launch in a panic from the island, just desperately trying to get away. Basically, none of them made it except for one. The funny thing is, I was actually doing rolls to determine if the ship that contained Flux and Firnacil ever disintegrated and just fell apart in the ocean. It didn't. They had really good luck on that. Most of the others were not so lucky, like the one carrying Rory, for instance. But we're talking about the island here. So the island is disintegrating, and all this, other stuff happens that I'm discussing today, I believe, actually, in a video you may have watched already. And then the ley line was reconnected to the island. The ley line was shoved up to reconnect back to where it should be, which will have some long-term effects we're still working on. But anyways, with that done, the island immediately started reconstructing itself, and everyone's like, oh, thank God, we're safe. So now they just had an island with infinite resources and no way to defend it whatsoever. I think you can guess what happened next. The funny thing is, it was kind of a gamble as to which group would find them first, and one of the big plans of the party was to try and approach with strength on the negotiation table, to basically be like, oh, we will trade away this stuff, this Pirial, which is worthwhile to you, if you do this kind of thing, to basically make it seem, it's bluffing, to make it seem as if they were bargaining from a position of strength, rather than, oh God, please don't conquer us, please. Because the Visayan Lacell inhabitants would have no ability to withstand any kind of force whatsoever. Any kind of organization from the mainland would crush the entire island without much effort. Well, the first group to find the island was a group of people you may have heard mentioned a few times called the Tumarok. The Tumarok showed up, and there's not many live witness accounts, so I'm not going to tell you the full details of how they conquered the island. It took them about 3 hours to conquer the whole island, and once they did so, they immediately turned all the populace there into a slave caste and started pushing them towards constructing all sorts of weird devices and mechanical things that they don't have any idea what they're doing, and of course, non-stop excavating resources, including huge quantities of Pirial. Now, I mentioned earlier that they didn't really do anything past copper. Well, see, the thing is, these people had never really advanced that much because they hadn't really had a need to. So the idea, for those of you who don't know, mining isn't just you go and pick at a rock, right? I mean, you can do that. There is such a thing as surface mining. But after a while in real life, surface mining ran out. We couldn't do it anymore. So we started coming up with new methods of mining, which involved the tunneling thing and the water thing and then actual carts and all that fun stuff. We came up with new ways to dig into the earth and get at its resources. These people never had to, so it was always surface mining. That's why they had so little access to iron and to perial and a few other resources that were actually plentiful on Visayan Lacell, because it is a huge abundance of mineral resources for obvious reasons. For those of you who don't know, perial is an extremely valuable metal that is highly conductive to magic. That's its basic value. It's also very durable. I'd say on the level of like titanium, something like that. So they start mining the crap out of Visayan Lacell, and they recognize that it's replenishing, so they are just, and they have this almost systematic thing of just, and then it replenishes, and then it replenishes. They are just churning out ton after ton after ton of this perial and doing something with it. Also, titanium. They are working with a lot of titanium, which is also in abundance on the island. It was actually much more difficult for them to harvest the titanium because it's much deeper in, and it's literally hard to reach the titanium veins before the earth surrounding it replenishes itself. But they found a way. Thanks to the fact that Fearness, Seal, and Flux had literally left the door open to the Scion facilities when they left, they also found their way into those. That wasn't a big deal because they don't actually care that much, and they are not scions, so they can't interact with anything there. But they did establish a few sentries, which was kind of a problem for the party later on. But the slave humans soon found a hidden vigilante who was moving through the Tumorok unnoticed somehow to try and help them. It was a human who called himself Flux, which is very confusing because Flux wasn't actually a human prior to this. But he tried to help free people and save people. Hagaide, through interesting circumstances, ended up imprisoned on Visayan Lacell as well, and ended up freed as a result of these alterations. And then, for some unknown reason, the vast majority of the Tumorok horde just left one day. Now, you guys know the reason why, so I'll go ahead and tell you the reason. Aphis Lacell was unveiled thanks to the actions of Gerlin, and was brought to the attention of the Tumorok thanks to the actions of the party. And the party kind of went out of their way to distract the Tuskers and the humans of Aphis Lacell, so when the Tumorok came over, well, you can probably guess what happened there. So the Tumorok left to go conquer Aphis Lacell, and the humans were like, oh god, we gotta get out of here right now. By happenstance, there was a large psionic airship, previously known as the Skyclaw, now known as the Spurka, which was being headed by the Olthoi. This airship was huge. It was actually more designed as a transport and carrier ship than an actual battleship. And so it came over and just started transporting massive amounts of people, not literally teleporting, but I mean, it would land and just, get on the frickin' ship, and evacuated the greater whole of the Visayan people, all the humans and whatnot. And then, and as they were leaving, the Tumorok were coming back because they cut it very, very tight, very close, in order to avoid that force. Because even the Spurka didn't want to, even the Olthoi, I should say, don't want to mess with the Tumorok. So the Spurka left, took the Visayan people to Holtberg, where they became refugees and general gutter trash of the society. And Rory's been trying to do what he can with regards to that. There's some success, some failure, and some other interesting things we'll get into later. Visayan Lacell, as of right now, is under full Tumorok occupation. But it's okay, because as of now, there's just the Tumorok there and their infinite resources. I'm sure that won't turn out bad at all. I hope you've enjoyed this little lore thing. Again, if you have anything else you want me to discuss lore-wise in Primus, I am all ears. You may note it down in the comments. And I'll see you next week, where we'll discuss Dareth as a whole.